Welcome to the Women in STEM podcast that focuses on the intersectionality of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. We focus on how we can amplify the voices of women in STEM and make them aware of the multiple different career opportunities that are available. Hello, welcome to the Women in STEM podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hey, I'm Julie Kratz, and I do allyship training and research and writing.
Great. I'm looking forward to going into much more depth about you because I've done my research and I know there's so much to cover. I was curious, as the overarching theme will be around allyship, as to how you were first introduced to allyship and what form did it look like for you?
Yeah, allyship's always been something that I didn't necessarily have the words or, naming nomenclature to describe what it was, but definitely growing up with a single mom, really always was my greatest ally personally, always believing in me, pushing me, challenging me, listening to me, a lot of the behaviors that allies tend to do well in the workplace. And so when I entered the workplace 20 years ago, it was quite surprising that I was continuously the only woman in, male-dominated settings, but you could argue every industry is pretty male-dominated, especially STEM as you focus on. I was in manufacturing and then consulting and financial services, and 12 years I spent in corporate work, just never felt that sense of belonging. But when I did feel included, it was when allies, would invite me into spaces, would make sure that I was heard in meetings, would take me seriously and not undermine me. Or a lot of times women get underestimated, like, wow, that's so great. And it's like, really, like, I can do more than that. And so, yeah, that was my biggest lesson. And then when I started my own business focused on women in leadership 10 years ago, DEI and D and I weren't, acronyms we used very often back then. And so my work really centered on how to get more allies, more men involved in the conversation around women in leadership because, it's kind of a chicken and egg problem. If we don't have women up there, we need the people up there to help support us so that we can advance because the progress we've made has been pretty dismal. It doesn't look much better, sadly, than when I entered corporate 20 years ago.
And you kind of mentioned a bit around the influence, but I'm really curious around your book. Allyship in Action. In this book, you outline 10 key strategies for living more inclusively. And I was wondering if you could walk us through some of the most impactful ones.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, Allyship in Action was really written in response to what I was hearing from organizations that were really leaning in hard to diversity work for the first time. And let's be honest, summer of 2020 brought a lot of that energy that has not quite sustained, but that's another story. And so Allyship in Action was really practices because I think allyship is not a self-proclamation. It's not a finish line. I win, I'm an ally kind of thing. It's not a one and done exercise. It's a lifetime learning journey, myself included. And so I often call myself an ally in training. And when I thought about the skills that were most helpful for me and the allies that I'd seen be successful around me, it was really everything from empathy to vulnerability to curiosity, to candor. Having these conversations are not linear. They're very nuanced, they're very complex, and giving people the tools so that you can ask, more insightful questions. You can glean more from other perspectives. And when I think about the number one tool that allies really need, and it sounds very basic and at its core, it's oversimplified, is listening and really listening, not listening to respond to what you're going to say next, as most of us do, but truly kind of trying to park your thoughts and just focus on what someone's sharing with you. And that's really important for historically marginalized groups because they're often not heard, not believed, and people lack the lived experience of working with people like them. And so they rely on outdated stereotypes and assumptions that aren't so helpful. So when we listen to learn, that's a real pivotal trick, not a tip as an ally, I would say. No, there's no tricks. But really, if you want to be a better ally, you have to first understand I don't know what I don't know yet. And the only way I'm going to know more is through education, through listening to others. And guess what? On the other side of it, the more I learn, the more I grow, the better I get as a human being. So it really is a win-win.
I really liked how you summarized all of that. And the strategies seem very actionable. How can you help organizations to implement them?
Yeah. Yeah, it's really when I think about what organizations need to do, it's one thing for individuals to take action, like the book Allyship in Action really highlights key practices you can take individually. But what we're really up against is these outdated systems, whether it's how we hire, how we recruit, how we promote people, how we make board placement decisions. All of these are kind of under the outdated architecture of patriarchy and white supremacy. And these inherent structures haven't really changed in the workplace since its modern kind of invention post World War II in the 1950s. And so this kind of Mad Men era where it was, let's be honest, mostly white men in executive positions. They built it. It worked for them. People that have caretaking responsibilities, people with disabilities, people in the LGBTQ plus community, of course, not so much thought of in that framework. And so I think as allies, what we have to do is just broaden our lens. Like if it doesn't work for some, it probably doesn't work great for all. And there's a really great analogy I love to use that we borrow from the disability inclusion world is in the 1970s here in the United States where I live, we started cutting curbs. So cutting out on that part of the pavement so that somebody with a wheelchair basically had a ramp to get on the sidewalk instead of, kind of having to tilt it side to side and maneuver it over the curb. Really problematic and, very difficult. Well, what did that curb cut effect do for folks that are not disabled? Well, for me, as somebody that pushes a stroller with little children, super helpful for me. Someone that likes to ride bikes. It's really great that I don't have to jump my bike over a curb, so that curb cut works better for me as well. For folks that have joint issues or somebody that has a temporary disability, it's also lovely that they can navigate the spaces. So the more inclusive we are for historically marginalized groups, really the more inclusive we make it for everyone. And so what I'd encourage allies to do is think about what do the curbs look like at your organization? Where are we losing diverse talent? Where are we not seeing the diversity we want to see? And why is that? Why aren't we reflecting the world of which we're operating in and probably hoping to serve? What's the disconnect? And you got to peel back the onion a little bit. It's not usually blatant racism or sexism or ableism or homophobia that's contributing to this. It's much more nuanced. It's much more subtle and usually in the form of just biases and outdated stereotypes like, I don't know if she's qualified or, she doesn't seem to have the confidence. She's done it once. Could she do it again? We hear those phrases quite often when we're talking about historically marginalized groups, but we don't hear that when we're talking about dominant group members, not nearly as much. This has been well studied in performance review data and hiring data. So the more we get to the root of what the issue is, the better we can all be.
As you know, this is the Women in STEM podcast, and I mainly focus on helping to amplify the voices of women in STEM. And you mentioned in your work around male allyship, which I think is quite specifically important to this podcast. And I was wondering if you would be able to share any success stories that you've heard from people with regards to this.
Yeah, yeah. Men as allies, I think, is really critical and really important still. I first started writing and doing research around men as allies really 9 years ago. And, when I revisit the tools that I researched and did a lot of interviews and secondary research on, still the ones that I recommend today. And it's not a step-by-step process, but I do think it starts from a place of empathy. And so what we know for men, a lot of times, if you grew up as a cisgender straight male and, just work within the constraints of society, probably don't know a lot what it's like to be a woman of all places, the workplace, of course, right? Why would you? I wouldn't know the opposite way as well. And so it starts from empathy. Again, listening to the stories, understanding the perspectives of women, understanding the lived experiences that are often very different. And so we found in the research, a lot of men that had daughters, of course, were more empathetic because they'd seen it firsthand. That's not a prerequisite to being an ally. I don't really love that being the reason, to be honest, because you should care even if you don't have a daughter. But oftentimes that lens, who are the women that are important in your life? Sisters, moms, aunts, friends, colleagues, mentors. Think about how could I better understand their experiences and what do they wish more allies were doing? I think that's just such a great question to ask. Like, I want to be a better ally as a man. What would be something you'd recommend to me? And be willing to do your own research too. You don't want to put the ownership of, solving these complex issues by people that didn't create a lot of these systems. But empathy, story sharing. I think sharing our stories is such a deeply human primal thing. We've done it for centuries, because that's how humans have survived. We pass down stories over time. When we were cave dwelling, there's artifacts of stories. And we know in our language as it developed, important story was really important. So I think sharing your story. What's your ally? Why? Why is this important to you? Um, Listen to the stories of women around you. I often share if someone is vulnerable enough to share their story, and I ask for permission if I can share it, and anonymously share it. It's just as powerful. The carrying somebody's story with you and shedding light on it for others to see is one of a very powerful thing you can do as an ally. And people remember stories, more than stats and figures. There's so many stats that support women, 39% higher profitability rate, 87% better decision rate. I mean, I could go on with all these statistics, but people don't remember them, and they've been around for decades. So story, and then the last two kind of strategies that I originally wrote about that I think are absolutely still relevant today is speaking up. We need to have a call-in culture where microaggressions or non-inclusive behavior is not tolerated. Most workplaces, it's still, I've heard so many stories over the years. I'm not even surprised anymore. And everything from like a woman of color presenting and men openly laughing on the Zoom call at her expense and that being tolerated. No one saying anything in the moment. We have to have a call-in culture where someone says, hey, this isn't okay. And you're held accountable for better behavior. That's just disrespectful, and no one should be treated that way in the workplace. So we really need people to speak up, keep your radar on the lookout for these things, and be willing to use your voice. You don't always have to do it publicly. You can do it privately too. I noticed that. What would you like me to have done, or what's something I could do to be helpful? Right? You can have that private one-on-one if you're not, an extroverted, more vocal person. And then the other big thing hasn't shifted, not anything has gotten worse through the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic is work and life integration. We're not doing a great job of that here where I am in the United States. It's awful. But women in particular are 70% of primary caregivers. And so not only is it young children, aging parents, aging family members, women are just tasked with that more often than men are. And so I think men, and we know this from the research, that when we have more self-advocacy, self-care, better caretaking, flexibility. We know that doesn't just make it better for women as caregivers, that makes it better for everyone to have that flexibility to go to a doctor's appointment, a kid's soccer game. Like, why should we be working so hard to not enjoy the things in life we love? And so those would be the strategies. I'm currently rewriting the book. So I wonder how much of that'll shift or change. So listeners, stay tuned.
Oh, that's very exciting. Let's switch gears. You've touched on education a bit. I was curious to know if you could tell us a bit more about Little Allies. What inspired you to write a book for children about inclusion? Quick break before we get back to our conversation. I want to remind you to follow, rate, and review the Women in STEM podcast on whatever streaming platform. Your support really helps us to reach more listeners and continue to bring inspiring stories and valuable insight. Don't forget to share this episode with your friends and colleagues who might be interested in learning a bit more about women in STEM. Also, make sure to check out our new LinkedIn page, the Women in STEM podcast, where you get to see some of the latest advancements in technology and learn more about women in STEM.
Yeah. I was the summer of 2020, I mean, globally, we just had such a reckoning around Black Lives Matter. And, as somebody that was a woman, gone through the Me Too movement or these social movements that were taking hold, and my then 6-year-old daughter was asking a lot of questions. at home. And, I was a DEI practitioner and didn't know how to answer them. And I looked for a lot of resources, support, and there's some great organizations out there, but I couldn't find anything like what I wanted to create is really inclusive education, not for kiddos, because shocker, they already know how to be inclusive most of the time. They're not perfect, but they know what's fair and what's right and wrong. And it was the adults that were having issues, right? Like, I don't know about critical race theory or, whatever, wokeism, whatever jargon had been thrown around that month. And parents, caregivers, educators were really struggling. And school boards were becoming more divisive here in the United States. And I just thought, what if there was a tool? What if there was a way for people to get education and relate it to children? And so really just took the lens of younger people and really youth workers, people that are working with youth on a regular basis and thinking about what are the tools that they need. And they're not that different. It's just the context is different, right? How do you create empathy with young people? Or how do you encourage story sharing with young people? How do you talk about microaggressions or non-inclusive behaviors with young people? Because they happen often. My daughter's now 10 and we have countless examples of them, sadly. And so when we teach adults how to have these conversations, they're better able to show up and answer the questions that kids naturally have. And kids, even the starkest of questions, really do come from a place of curiosity. We know that racism, sexism, while we're all swimming in these waters, we know that most of those biases aren't really formed until age 12. And so we've got a great window where we can be proactive in teaching kids modeling these behaviors so that they don't have to go through inclusive training later in life. I kind of think it's silly thinking that we're going to, not that we can't shift behaviors as adults, but it's a heck of a lot easier to get it right the first time.
You're right. It definitely is a lot more easier to get it right once they're much younger and much more willing to learn, much more curious around the world, about the world. But for leaders who are listening, who want to become better allies, what are the first steps that they should be taking?
Yeah, I think especially if you're a leader, the most important thing is modeling inclusion for the rest of the team. And a couple practical ways that you can do that, because modeling is our best teacher. We're taking note constantly of our environment, scanning for what's acceptable, what's not, how do other people behave. That's why we mirror and match. We tend to behave like people we spend a lot of time with. And so, as leaders, think about behaviors you want to model. What are the behaviors you want more from your team? And put an inclusion lens on it and think, my gosh, I really wish more people were participating in meetings. I really wish people were more clear with expectations. I really wish we could, you know, get more talent in the organization that came from different places. We always get people from the same school or same area, whatever it is. Okay, put together your wish list and then start doing it, start modeling it. You don't have to do all the work, but say how important it is to you and reinforce that behavior when you see it. Call it in when you don't see it. And it's these micro behaviors that really do create a culture of inclusion. And I don't think you have to have a position, a manager or leader to model this. Anyone can. But if you happen to be fortunate enough to be in a leadership role, you have an even more important realm of influence and spotlight on you that people are paying attention to. So use it wisely and think about the leader you would have wanted to work for. How could you do more of that? Because I'd love to think we're always getting it right all the time. Not, right. I mess up, bumble and stumble, and that's okay, right? As long as you're committed to growing and getting better, that's what people really want to see. They don't want to see perfection, they want to see progress.
What would you say is the most common mistake you see that tends to be well intended by allies, but yeah, what's something that you think should be highlighted that they should take into consideration?
Yeah, there's a lot of we call it bumbles and stumbles in our work. And you're right, intentions, usually positive, the impact not so much. So in DEI, we often use the framework intent versus impact. And it's not perfect, but it does help break it down for people. Is you could have gone into that meeting thinking you're being really inclusive and sharing all your great ideas. Your intention might have been wonderful, but the impact might have been you interrupted other people. You didn't listen to other people's ideas as much as you really wanted your own ideas. Right. And so context matters. Thinking about how you show up and being willing to embrace some of your weaknesses as opportunities. And I often try to model that with my team. I'm not so good at giving really clear expectations, and I'm also not so good at really detail-oriented processes. And so if I model that and let people know and label that, then when it shows up, they're not going to think I'm trying to be difficult or not a good team inclusive person. They're going to think, well, Julie has told me those are some of her weaknesses. So maybe this is an opportunity for me to be helped as well. And so mistakes are absolutely a part of the process. I often use the metaphor of learning to ride a bike. If you remember when you learned to ride a bike or you've taught a kid how to ride a bike, they don't just like get on and just go for miles. No, of course, they fall off like many, many times. It's incredibly painful to watch. It's incredibly painful to experience. This is what allyship is. You're getting on that allyship bike and you are bound to fall off a few times. The biggest thing is when you fall, ask yourself what you learned. How would you do it differently next time? It's not a gotcha moment. You're not going to be canceled. It's when people don't own it and they get defensive that creates a problem. So own your behavior after the mistake and just apologize, commit to be better.
We're coming towards the end of the interview, and before we wrap up, I wanted to know what are the final messages you have for the listeners, especially for women in STEM?
Yeah. Yeah, I think baby steps. So we didn't get here overnight and we're not going to get out of this lack of representation problem overnight. However, as somebody that has three daughters, I certainly hope that we have better representation in STEM and all these kind of older male dominated industries. And so think about what are the incremental steps you can take. What is the one thing I could do? One idea I gave you from this conversation or from the podcast that you've been listening to was one thing I want to do. I think 80% of the journey is education. And maybe you're already pretty educated in this. Maybe you've had a lot of lived experiences with this. How could you educate others and share your experiences? And it's just a step at a time. Right. And so what I've seen, especially in the throes of DEI pushback as of late, the organizations that didn't make a big proclamation, didn't make a big donation, didn't do a big social media ta-da, but they just kind of stayed with it like a drumbeat over time. And they had a little bit of training. They had a little bit of communications. They've talked about it in their all hands meeting. They have a strategy and they have employee resource groups. Those are the organizations that are really doing the work. And it's nothing like showy and like, wow. It's often these small yet really impactful things that have a huge cumulative effect. So whether you're a leader of an organization that can do some of those things and influence those things, or an everyday hopeful ally, just the next best thing. Like, what's the next thing I can do? What's the next thing? And make it manageable for you because sometimes I have people all fired up and like, I'm going to do all these things. Like, I'd love to believe that for you, but it's probably much more likely that you're going to do one thing. So pick the one thing, and then once you get that done, pick the next one thing.
How best can my listeners connect with you?
Yeah, I appreciate that. Well, thanks for referencing the books. Those are great ways to stay in touch, and all of those are easy to find on Amazon or on our website, nextpivotpoint.com. And I'm on LinkedIn. I post most days, Julie Kratz, Kratz. And I have a Forbes column as well under my name. You can find it, Julie Kratz. Thank you. Stay in touch. I am always looking for curious questions. So if you have a curious question based on this conversation, my contact info is on my website, nextpivotpoint.com. I'd love to help you research or find more information on that. So feel free to reach out. I always respond to my email, usually same day.
Great. Thank you so much for coming on the Women in STEM podcast.
Thank you for having me, Kelly.
Listeners, if you've enjoyed this episode, please make sure to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite streaming platform, leave a review and rating to help us reach more listeners, and follow our social medias, the latest updates and behind the scene content. Join us next week for another exciting episode. And until then, keep exploring the world of STEM and empowering women in STEM.